I still remember the day Mrs. Wallace first walked into our classroom. It was late September, the kind of day where the wind cut through your jacket and the sky hung gray and heavy over our small town. The kind of day where everything felt a little off, like the world was holding its breath. Our school was tiny, just one brick building with peeling white paint, nestled at the edge of the woods. Everyone knew everyone. The halls always smelled like old books and cafeteria spaghetti, and the bell rang with a shrillness that made your teeth clench. When Mrs. Givens, our old math teacher, moved to Florida to be closer to her grandkids, the school board brought in Mrs. Wallace as a replacement. She didn't look like a teacher. She didn't smile or ask us our names. She had short, wiry hair, kind of a dull reddish-brown, and her skin was pale and blotchy, like she was always cold. Her eyes were a washed-out blue, almost gray, and when she looked at you, it felt like she was looking through you, like you weren't really there. She wore long skirts and heavy sweaters, even when the heaters in our classrooms were cranked up too high. Her hands were always hidden in her sleeves, and she had this weird habit of rubbing her fingers together under the fabric, like she was trying to scrape something off. The first few weeks, she was just strange. Not mean, not really. Just odd. She spoke in this flat, almost robotic voice and never raised it, even when the boys in the back wouldn't stop talking. She didn't have any pictures on her desk, no mugs with corny teacher quotes, nothing personal. She'd write our assignments on the board, then sit at her desk and stare at the papers in front of her, like she couldn't quite understand what they were. Then she started offering extra help after school. It started with a few kids who were struggling. Mark Jensen, who could never get the hang of long division. Leah Sanders, who always mixed up her fractions. Mrs. Wallace would stand at the front of the room and say, "I'd like to see you after class," in that same hollow voice, and they'd nod, eyes downcast, cheeks burning. At first, I thought it was normal. I mean, extra help was a good thing, right? But then she started calling on kids who weren't struggling. Kids who got straight A's and never caused trouble. I remember when she asked Sarah Thomas to stay after class. Sarah was practically a teacher's pet, polite, quiet, always with the right answer. She looked so confused, but Mrs. Wallace didn't explain. She never did. The next day, Sarah wasn't at school. Her mom called the principal, saying she'd come down with the flu. But by the third day, people started to talk. Sarah wasn't the kind of kid who missed school. She had perfect attendance since kindergarten. When I asked my mom about it, she just shushed me and turned up the news, her face pale and tight. More kids started disappearing after that. One by one, they'd be asked to stay after class, and then they'd just vanish. Parents would call the school, the cops would show up, but no one seemed to have any answers. It was like the earth had opened up and swallowed them whole. The town changed. People stopped letting their kids play outside. The streets were empty by sunset, and the schoolyard was silent during recess. I started keeping my head down, praying Mrs. Wallace wouldn't notice me. My grades slipped, but I didn't care. I thought maybe if I seemed dumb, she'd think I wasn't worth keeping after school. And all the while, Mrs. Wallace went on teaching, her voice never wavering, her hands always hidden in those sleeves. When Sarah Thomas disappeared, our town spiraled. The local news started showing her picture every hour, a smiling girl with blonde pigtails, braces, and a light pink sweater. The kind of photo they take on school picture day when everything still feels normal. The police set up a tip line. Volunteers combed through the woods. The school held assemblies about stranger danger, and every adult in town suddenly turned into a watchdog. But no one seemed to look at Mrs. Wallace. The thing is, when you're a kid, adults seem untouchable. Even the weird ones. Especially the weird ones. Grown-ups have this invisible shield of authority around them, and Mrs. Wallace wore hers like armor. She showed up every day, called roll, handed out worksheets. She even started baking cookies and bringing them in, the smell of warm chocolate mixing with the musty classroom air. But fewer kids were eating them. Fewer kids were there at all. 3 more kids went missing over the next month. Danny Fisher, who sat 2 seats behind me in history. Megan Liu, who had the neatest handwriting I'd ever seen. And Cole Haverford, who used to trade Pokemon cards with me at recess. They all had the same story, stayed after school for extra help and then, nothing. Their parents called the school, their voices tight and panicked. The principal, Mr. Jacobs, would just shake his head, his hands wringing together like he was trying to wash away his guilt. It was during this time that I started to notice the little things. How Mrs. Wallace's sweaters seemed looser, like she was shrinking inside them. How the cuffs of her sleeves had these tiny, dark stains that never quite washed out. She stopped looking at us when she talked, her eyes fixed somewhere above our heads, staring at something only she could see. One afternoon, after school let out, I was walking home with my friend Emma. She lived a few blocks away, and our route took us past the staff parking lot. It was mostly empty by then, but Mrs. Wallace's old green station wagon was still there. The windows were fogged up, and the back end of the car sagged under the weight of something heavy. I caught a glimpse of a small, red backpack through the glass. My stomach twisted. I was pretty sure it was Danny Fisher's. He'd had this worn patch on the side, a faded superhero logo his mom had sewn on to cover a rip. "Do you see that?" I whispered to Emma, my breath clouding in the cold air. She squinted, then grabbed my arm, pulling me away. "We shouldn't be here." I wanted to tell someone. I wanted to run to the principal, to the police, to my parents. But fear sat on my chest like a rock. If Mrs. Wallace found out, if she called me in for extra help, I knew I wouldn't come back. I started pretending to be sick. I'd fake a cough, hold my forehead against the radiator to get warm, anything to stay home. My mom believed me for a while, but eventually, she started giving me that look, half worried, half annoyed, and made me go back. Every morning, I'd slip into my seat, avoid eye contact, and pray that Mrs. Wallace would skip over my name when she asked who needed tutoring. And then, finally, something happened. The cops showed up at school. Not just a couple of officers, but a whole squad, blue lights flashing through the frosted windows, their radios crackling. They walked into Mrs. Wallace's classroom, and for the first time I saw her face change. She looked scared. Her hands, hidden under those baggy sleeves, started to tremble. The kids in the room went quiet, a silence so heavy you could almost hear hearts beating. One of the officers spoke to her, his voice too low for us to hear, and she just stood there, frozen. Then, without a word, she turned and bolted. We heard the chaos, the heavy boots, the shouts, the slam of a door somewhere down the hall. Some kids started crying, and others just sat there, stunned. I didn't move, didn't breathe, afraid that if I made a sound, she'd come back for me. When they finally let us out of the building, I saw her station wagon again. The back hatch was open, and the red backpack lay in the snow, half buried and soaking through. Emma found me outside. She grabbed my hand, and for a long time, neither of us said anything. We just stood there, 2 kids in the cold, staring at that empty car. I thought it was over. I thought we were safe. But it was only the beginning. The news hit that evening. Our quiet town was suddenly the center of every headline, every TV broadcast. They ran Mrs. Wallace's mugshot on a loop, a different face than the one we knew. Her hair was matted, and her skin looked gray under the harsh fluorescent lighting. Her eyes, still that pale, washed-out blue, stared through the camera, unblinking. Her real name wasn't even Mrs. Wallace. It was Karen Lutz, a woman who had escaped from a prison 3 states over. She'd been serving time for assault and fraud. According to the reports, she'd stolen a dead woman's identity, moved to our town, and slipped right into our lives without anyone noticing. I sat on the couch with my parents, the news anchor's voice droning on about background checks and administrative failures. My mom had her hands over her mouth, her knuckles white. My dad just stared, his jaw tight, as if he couldn't quite believe it. Then they showed the footage of her house. It was a small, crumbling place at the end of Willow Lane, where the road turned to gravel and the trees seemed to close in on you. I'd ridden my bike past it 100 times. The windows were boarded up, and the yard was a mess of dead leaves and rusted metal. It had always looked abandoned, except, apparently, it wasn't. The camera panned to the basement windows, dark and smeared with dirt. I couldn't see inside, but I didn't want to. I knew what they'd find. When the news cut to a press conference, Sheriff Dawson stepped up to the mic. His face was red and sweaty, his voice strained as he read from his notes. During a search of the residence, he said, our officers discovered evidence linking Ms. Lutz to the recent disappearances of local children. Evidence. I knew what that meant, even if I didn't want to. They found them in the basement. 4 kids. Danny, Megan, Cole, and Sarah. They were alive, but barely. The doctors on TV said they were malnourished, covered in bruises, and deeply traumatized. The images they showed were blurred, but you could make out the thin, skeletal figures being carried out on stretchers, blankets pulled tight around them. Later, I learned the details. Mrs. Wallace, Karen, had built a makeshift prison in her basement. She'd soundproofed the walls and set up these metal cots with restraints. The police found ropes, chains, even a gag. There were empty food cans, water bottles, and a bucket in the corner that made my stomach turn when I thought about it. She'd been keeping them there for weeks, taking them one by one after school. She told them they were in trouble, led them to her car, and then everything would go dark. When they woke up, they were in that cold, damp basement with no way out. I heard rumors at school. How she'd starved them, hit them, whispered awful things to them in the dark. How she'd kept them just alive enough to make it last. We were all called into the counselor's office, one by one. They asked us questions about Mrs. Wallace, about whether she'd ever approached us, whether we'd seen or heard anything unusual. I wanted to tell them about the backpack, about the stains on her sleeves, but I couldn't find the words. Instead, I sat there, nodding and mumbling no until they let me go. The halls were different after that. Kids walked closer together, whispered softer. Teachers looked over their shoulders, and parents parked right by the door when they dropped us off. But what haunted me most wasn't what happened to those kids. It was how close I'd come to being one of them. How easily Mrs. Wallace could have called my name. The weeks after Mrs. Wallace's arrest felt like living in a bad dream. Our town turned into a ghost town, windows shut tight, kids pulled out of school, neighbors avoiding eye contact. The school closed down for a bit, for investigation purposes, they said. But I knew it was because no one wanted to step foot back in that building. When classes resumed, the empty desks were a constant reminder. Danny, Megan, Cole, and Sarah didn't come back. They were recovering somewhere far away, surrounded by doctors and therapists. The teachers avoided talking about them, but the silence only made it worse. Every now and then, I'd overhear someone mention them. A hushed voice in the hall, a name scribbled in a notebook. Kids started making up stories, how they saw shadows in the basement windows, how Mrs. Wallace's ghost would pull them into the darkness if they stayed after school. I hated how quickly it all turned into a story, a rumor, a dare. How the real terror, the real pain, was twisted into something we told each other to get a thrill. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. The way she used to stare past us, like we weren't even there. I started keeping my curtains closed, double-checking the locks, jumping at every creak in the floorboards. One afternoon, I made the mistake of looking up the news articles. There were hundreds of them, headlines shouting about the basement teacher and nightmare in a small town. One article had an interview with a detective who described the basement in awful, clinical detail. The restraints, the stains on the concrete floor, the smell. It was too much. I slammed my laptop shut and sat there, breathing hard, the room spinning. My parents wanted me to see a therapist. I went a couple of times, but every time I sat on that couch, I felt Mrs. Wallace's eyes on me. Like I was still in her classroom, and she was waiting to call my name. Emma and I drifted apart. She stopped coming to school altogether. Her mom said she'd moved to live with her aunt in another state. I didn't blame her. I wished I could run away, too. One evening, I decided to walk by Mrs. Wallace's house. I don't know why. Maybe I thought it would help me get over it, prove to myself that it was just a house, just a place where bad things happened but were now over. The police tape was still there, frayed and fluttering in the wind. The windows were dark, the door boarded up. I stood there on the sidewalk, staring at the basement window, the same one they'd pulled those kids out of. I thought I saw something move. My heart jumped, and I bit down on my lip until I tasted blood. It was just the wind, just the shadows. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still down there, waiting. Waiting for the next kid who didn't listen. I turned and ran, the cold air burning my lungs. I didn't stop until I reached my front door, the safe, familiar smell of my house washing over me. I never went back to Willow Lane. I never walked home alone again. And every night, before I went to bed, I'd look out my window. Just to make sure. Because the truth is, monsters aren't always the ones hiding under your bed. Sometimes, they're sitting at the front of the classroom, smiling, waiting for their turn.